All right, welcome to Office Hours today. Thanks for joining us. Margot is going to be leading the session, but I wanted to jump in and say hello. We're doing these once every other week for the time being, just so that as you're using EMTrack, especially leading up to vaccine season, or just in general as you're starting to do something in addition to COVID, you've got the resources from our side to be able to answer questions and connect with your peers. We want this to be about you. It's not about us. So if you've got questions, if you want to talk to each other, say hi. You can unmute yourself, do that. And that's great. It'd be a great use of time for us. So Margot, take it away.
Thanks, Akshay. So for those of you that haven't been here before, this is going to be our second EMTrack office hours. The first one we covered things like dashboards and incident types and some basic conversation about forms. You know, these are the things that you have to have. Today we're going to do a deeper dive into forms and form configuration and customization, because obviously that's a really huge part of doing the patient tracking. So today we've got obviously myself, Margot Reuter. I'm a support analyst. I've been here for over 7 years. Most of you, I think actually probably every one of you that I saw in the being on the call here has talked to me at one point in time or another, some as recently as yesterday. Elaine is also on. For those of you who don't know Elaine, she's also been with the company for over 17 years, and so she might jump in as well with a few things. And this is just kind of a little blip about both of us so that you've got some information on us, just in case you didn't know who we were. And obviously, we've just kind of covered the introduction. Things we're going to talk about today: regional settings that affect your forms, mobile forms versus web forms, editing a form, and modifying the form design. So we're not going to go through the full creation of a form, but we're going to talk about the different aspects of what it takes to create a form, to modify a form. One of the really nice things that we've implemented that I'll talk about and actually demonstrate is that we've actually added the ability to take someone else's form that you like and bring it into your EMTrack system. So if somebody else is like, oh yeah, I built this really cool form, you can actually take that and add it into your system. They can download it, send you a file, and you can bring it into your system, and basically not reinvent the wheel, because let's be honest, most of us have the same end objective. We're working through a lot of the same processes, and we just might need to tweak things based on our workflow versus as compared to someone else's. And that can happen even within your environment. Obviously, you might have one hospital or EMS agency that's tweaking things one way, or maybe one area of the state does things slightly different than another area. And it's nice because you can then take those forms, you can duplicate them, things like that, and give them, not reinvent and start a form from scratch, but use something existing and just make the necessary changes to make it appropriate for the person who's actually using it. So once we're done, like Akshay said, and for those of you who've been on sessions with me before, we will have time at the end. Knowing me, I will run over my allotted amount of time, which is about half an hour, but I'm going to try to talk fast enough to get through it. If you have questions at any point in time, feel free to stop me and ask questions. And then at the end, like I said, we'll have that question and answer open forum session for any other questions you guys might have. So first thing I want to talk about is mobile versus web. For those of you that have been working with EMTrack for a while, you probably remember back to the point when we didn't even have mobile. We do have mobile, we have web, so forms can be created for use on the mobile application. And for those of you that are maybe non-Android or iOS users, I apologize, you have to use the web on your phone. But for those that are Android and iOS users, you do have that ability to go ahead and use the application, use the mobile application for patient entry. Then we also have web forms, which they're labeled as web forms, but they do also work on EMTrack Lite, for those of you who may have EMTrack Lite, which was formerly known as EMTrack Desktop. So just be aware that a web form is also an EMTrack Lite form, formerly known as EMTrack Desktop, which is, for those of you that don't know, EMTrack Lite is actually an installed application on a Windows-based machine. so that you actually open an application, run EMTrack Lite rather than running the web-based interface. So a form cannot be changed from a web form to a mobile form, and a mobile form cannot be turned from a mobile form into a web form, just so that you're aware of that. A form can be shared with others, like I kind of mentioned back in the beginning. So if you have a form that somebody else wants and you're okay with it, you can download that form, send it to them, and they can use it. Or the same thing, if they have something, or if you see something that I showed today that you like, we can send that your way as well. Regional settings. So I want to point this out to you, and I actually discovered that a couple of things in the process of preparing for this that I thought you guys had access to. You don't, but I wanted to point them out anyway so that you guys are aware that these settings exist. So one of the settings is daily patient tracking. That's something that can actually be set by regional administrators. It does apply across the region, and what it does is it allows you to set up forms to be used for daily patient tracking, which just means that they will actually keep the patient ID as you go through various forms on the same device. So that's what that is. Mobile for smartphones is actually a setting that if it's not enabled, your mobile devices will not be able to log in. They will not work. You will not have mobile forms functioning. Allowing loading of data is something that we've added within, I want to say, about the last year. I don't know, time flies. It might have been in the last year and a half. But basically what that means is that you can actually set up the system so that when you actually put in a patient ID for a patient who already exists, it will automatically load that data. That also applies to folks who are staged participants. So for example, maybe you have a race that you're running, or maybe you're evacuating a hospital, and you've uploaded all of your current patients or all of the runners that could potentially be patients. And that means when they show up at your, at a medical tent for that runner and they get scanned, it'll automatically populate their information that you've entered into the system. Usually it's things like, first name, last name, maybe date of birth, some other essential information that you might want to see. But those are kind of the primary things that people usually like to see in that. And then there's also the patient edit link, which allows folks, if they're on the web and they go through to fill out a patient form, if that patient ID already exists, it will actually allow them to click on a link to actually go into that patient record and edit it within the patient record, rather than actually completing that form. So let me go ahead, and we're on to the demo. So let me switch screens here for a second. So first I'm going to pull this up. This is a user who is logged in as a regional administrator. So these are the things that you're going to see. So to see those regional settings, you're going to go into system settings and go into regional settings. And like I said, you guys don't have access to as many settings as we have at the Juvare level, at the system administrator level. So what you're going to see is you're going to see that enabled daily patient tracking. So if you select regional settings over here on the left, this is the one that you're going to see, is that enabled daily patient tracking. And that's what's going to allow you to go ahead and set up forms so that they're set up for daily patient tracking so that you can cycle through, for example, in EMS, a lot of times they like to do like a triage treatment transport type of situation. So they can take that same device, follow that person through the process, and it will remember that person as they go through. Or maybe they submit the form, they start their run, they submit the form, and then they go, oh, we need to update that, provide more information. They can go ahead and fill out the form again, update the information. It will remember that patient ID until they end the run. So that's what it looks like for you guys. Now for a system administrator, like I said, we have some additional settings here. So under regional settings for us, you'll see we have that enabling mobile for smartphones. So that's if you actually don't want the mobile applications to work at all in your region, you can reach out to us and we can turn that off. I don't think I've ever had anyone ask us to do that, but I do want to point out that it is an option. As a general rule, by default, we have this enabled for everyone. So just so that you're aware, it can be turned off. We, again, have that enabled daily patient tracking that you can see as well. On top of that, we also have these allow loading, and you'll see there's 4 different options here These first two are for patient data. The first is for password users, so those users that actually log in and use a password. And then we also can allow it for folks that log in with a PIN, and the EMTrack Lite users who generally are using a PIN as well. In addition to that, we have the option to allow that same thing for password users and PIN users for those staged users. So in other words, those folks that are maybe running the marathon who could become a patient, or for when you're evacuating, you want to get information into the system, but you don't want the patients to have a location yet, so they aren't actually in the incident, just in case they get discharged before you start your transition over of an evacuation, or maybe you're moving to a new hospital. So we do allow that as well. So you can configure that and say, you know what, I only want it allowed for my password users, or I want it allowed for both. So you can always reach out to us and we can make that change for you. The other one that I talked about is this disable patient edit link on the web, and you'll notice it says in the add forms. I do not have that selected right now. And basically what that's going to do is that's going to allow me, if I enter a patient ID that already exists in a form, it's going to give me that option to edit that patient. So I'm going to go ahead, let me drag this back out of the way here. So you can see if we come in here into patient forms, I have this start run option. This exists because I have daily tracking turned on. Now you'll notice if I hit start run here that it's going to say select a form. I don't have any forms that are configured for daily tracking, so therefore it's not going to give me anything. If I did have forms configured, you would see a list of the forms that are configured for daily tracking, and we would be able to go through them one at a time and they would process, just so that you understand that that's what that whole daily tracking is about, is that starting the run, you have forms that are for daily tracking, and I'll show you where that setting is shortly. And then you can process through and it will maintain that user's information. On the flip side, again, we can come in here and let me find a patient really quickly because I wrote one down and I can't find my Post-it note. So let me just pull up a tracking number of somebody that already exists. So we'll just do 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I come in here and I go into this and I say, oh, I need patient number 1, 2, 3, 4, you'll notice it says this patient already exists. Click load to update the information on this form, or go to the edit patient form. So this is demonstrating to you two of those aspects that I just showed you the check marks for. One is that ability to load the patient data if the patient's already in the system. The other one is that allowing the edit of a patient straight from that patient entry form. So if I were to click on edit patient, it would actually take me into the patient page. And let me show you what that looks like. So it'll take me straight into that patient document, and I can go through and update the information straight from here. There are clients that frequently say, you know what, I don't want that option in there because I want folks to actually just use the form because maybe they're entering specific information that's on that form and they don't need access to the rest of this information. So that's why we have that option for you to go ahead and change that. If I go through and I enter that patient again and I hit load, you'll notice that in this case it populated the age, so we know that this person is 67 years old. We know that they're a female, and it's identified that their complaint was cardiology, chest, and that they have chest pain. So you can see that's the information that was in their record that was brought in when I went ahead and loaded that patient. And you get that same option again on the mobile application. When you enter that form, it would give you the option to go ahead and load that patient data in there if the patient already exists, as long as those functions are enabled. So that's pretty much covering the regional settings aspect of it. Let me go ahead and flip-flop back over here into my slideshow. The next thing we're going to talk about is editing a form. Okay, so there's a lot of different things you can do when you edit a form. So one of the things you can do nowadays is you can actually add an icon. So for those of you who haven't been in looking at forms lately, we did add the functionality that you can now have an icon for web-based forms. Again, you can't do it for the mobile forms, but you can add it for the web-based forms. You can update the name of the form, so maybe you got a form from somebody else and you want to change it. You can go ahead and do that. You can also update the description, which is basically just what that form is about. We talked about that daily tracking. So when you turn that on at the regional level, it then gives you this opportunity on any form to add patients to select daily tracking. When that's selected, that means when you start a run, that's one of the forms that will be visible for you. We also have this visible option. So that's saying, hey, maybe you're working on a form and you're not ready for other people to see it yet. You can go ahead and take that check mark out or not select it in the first place. And at that point, folks won't be able to see, your users will not be able to see that form. If visible is not selected, the form exists, the form is active, but nobody can see it, so nobody can use it. So just be aware of that. If you create a form and somebody says, hey, I can't see it, it's probably because it's not set to visible. You'll also notice, and kind of in the screenshot here, what you can see it, we have that ability to restrict access to specific providers or to specific roles. So if you wanted a form that was specific to your hospitals, you could go ahead and share that with just the ED admin and ED normal roles. If you had something that maybe you have a hospital that says, hey, we want to use EMTrack to track patients for this evacuation and we want to do a customized form for it, or we're transferring from an old hospital to a new hospital and these patients are all going to get moved, so we want a custom form with these very specific fields on it, you can make that available to just that provider, and then only people that have access to, or have a role at that provider will be able to see that form. So it's a nice way to be able to set up custom forms and nobody else has to look at them. So, you know, if you have someone who says, hey, I've got this marathon that I've got running, I want this custom form, here's my hospitals and EMS agencies that are participating, you can set it so that only those hospitals and EMS agencies can see that form, and that way everybody else in the state who has no idea that there's even a marathon going on in that area, or who's not going to have access to the patients, isn't going to need to have any involvement with that event, won't even be bothered. They won't see it. They won't have that in the list. And it just basically cleans things up and makes it nice and easy. It also allows for that additional customization, so you don't have to have, you know, a marathon patient form that is one size fits all across the state. Because let's be honest, for any of us that have any type of events, we all know that, you know, one person may have a festival or have a marathon or have an evacuation, and they have different needs depending on different areas, depending on sizes of the hospital, and all of that, you know, depending on the type of environment. Maybe it's a long-term care facility rather than a hospital. So we've got that type of opportunity. Maybe it's an area that's evacuating because of flooding, and you're dealing with patients, but you're also dealing with actual personnel in shelters. So you've got those options to set those restrictions. And now we're going to flip back over to the demo here. So we're over here, and in order to go to forms, for those of you who have not seen forms, you're going to go into System Settings. And right over here on the left under Other Settings, you've got an identifier called Patient Forms. You're going to click on that, and what that's going to give you is visibility into all of your forms. So the first column is going to be the name. The second is going to be that type of form, so whether it's a mobile form or a web form. It's going to tell you if it's enabled for daily tracking. So you can see here there are some forms that are enabled for daily tracking. Is it an active form? So some forms are not active because maybe you haven't completed. In this case, the design has not been completed, therefore it's not going to be active. It's never been published. That will also be another thing that makes it not active. We have this changes section here because if you've made some changes and saved them but not published them, it will identify here that you've got changes in it, but that way you know those changes are not published. And then that visible check mark that we talked about, you can see over here. At a glance, you can tell that which forms are visible to your users and which ones are not. The next section over here is the owner, and I want to point this out because you'll notice some of these forms say Juvare and some of them say Y Training, which is the region that I'm in. We have a top-level set of forms that we share with folks. So in this case, I've shared things like a discharge form, a receive form, sepsis assessment, STEMI assessment, things like that. So we share those with you so that you can actually have a default form for those situations that you can have. You can look at it. The one thing that you cannot do with a Juvare form is you can't change the design. However, you can copy it and then make modifications to your version of it, which is why you'll see for some of these, they'll have almost the exact same name. But for example, this evacuee form here, you can see this one has Juvare's name, and this one has the Y training name on it. And that's because that Juvare form was copied, and the name we decided to give it was version 2. It could be the exact same name. There's nothing that stops you from doing that. But I just want to point out that you do have that indicator there. So if you say, oh, I'm trying to modify this form and it belongs to Juvare, we're not going to let you modify that. We will let you make a copy of it so that you have a copy within your region to play with and to make those changes to. So just be aware of that. Now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to grab one of these. We'll grab this STEMI assessment here. So we do have the option to come in here and edit this form. So when I come in here and I click edit, you can see there's no icon currently set. I can go ahead and click choose, and it allows me to choose the icon. So you can see this is the series of icons that we have. And I'll go ahead and just choose this one here. You can choose the color of it. So we'll say this one's going to be red. And then you also have icon styles here. So it lets you actually pick light, which you can see thins out the lines a little bit more. You can pick regular, which makes them a little bit thicker. And then you can also pick solid, which fills them in and makes it a little bit more of a visible icon. And again, this only is going to apply to forms that are web forms. So a patient entry form for the web. Mobile forms, you will not see this option at all. Now, here you can see we've got a name because this is a Juvare form. I can't change it. We can, however, on a Juvare form, you have the option to select if it is visible or not. And you can also set that visibility. So you can say what providers are going to be able to see it and or what roles are going to be able to see it. So you do have that additional availability. And I'll go ahead and click Save here. And you can see as we look through here, oh, it didn't refresh. Let me grab another one here. So we'll grab this STEMI one. Oh, that one's still in design. That will work anyway. So if we come in here and we go to Edit, again, you can see this one is adding through the mobile. So we do not have that opportunity to add the icon. We can change the name on it, though. So I could say, I can make it just be STEMI. I can say description, used to submit information on a STEMI patient. And I can turn that daily tracking off and on. I can select if I want all providers to see this or maybe just selected providers. I'm going to say, you know what, I'm only going to have these 2 EMS agencies are actually going to use this. Or I can say selected roles, and I can say I only want my EMS folks to use it because this is going to be something that's going to be submitted from the EMS folks. So I can say that even within here, it's only going to be these 3 roles that have access to this. And I'll go ahead and save that. And you can see down here, I've got some other forms. You can see the icons. These are some of the vaccination forms where you can see the icons on here. We can change the settings on them. Again, if we go into that edit, we can take this and say, you know what, I would rather see that as a solid icon. We'll say okay. I can save that change, and you'll notice the difference when we come down here. So you can see it's a little bit darker. And then if we come over here to the patient page, in case you guys didn't see this, let me set my icons to be large icons. My icons are not refreshing. I'm going to have to figure out what's going on here. So it should be refreshing and giving me those icons here. I may just need to log out and log back in for that change to take effect. But we'll do that. We'll do that at the end just to make sure that it's working. So we've got all of that. The other thing I want to point out to you guys is I know sometimes you have folks who go, oh man, you know, I've got this form, I've got this thing going on. It's very important. I need my form moved up to the top of the list, right? It's an important form. I need that to be the first one on the list. Whether you're hosting the Super Bowl and you have a Super Bowl form, so you have a whole bunch of people that you want to be able to see that, whether you have, you're responding to a disaster and you've got a form that you've specifically created related to that disaster, whether it's a marathon or some other race or festival or event, and you want that form moved up to the top, you can absolutely do that. So down here at the bottom, you'll see we've got that create form and create form from file that we've seen before, but we also have the option to sort the web forms and to sort the mobile forms. So if I come over here and I click sort web forms, you'll see it gives me a list of all of my forms. And I can come down here and I can say, you know what, I want to go ahead and actually list that vaccination registration form up at the very top. So I can go ahead and do that and then hit save. And now you'll notice if we come over to the patient page that that vaccination registration form is right up here at the top, and it's that very first selection. So we can move these around, order them in whatever form we want, and then we can change them again. And we can also do the same thing for mobile forms. So at the bottom of that patient forms page, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you have the option to sort your mobile forms as well. So we can come down here and say, you know what, we think that that STEMI assessment is really an important form. I'm going to move that one up to the top. I can go ahead and hit save. And now when I look at the mobile forms, that form is going to be at the top. All right, yeah, and that's pretty, I might actually make this in decent time today. So that's pretty much all there is on that form, on editing the forms. Let me switch back over to my presentation here. And the next thing we're going to talk about is modifying the design, and this is where all my time management's going to go haywire for you. So form designs can be modified in so many ways to let you create a form or modify a form so that it works for your workflow. It's like I've been talking about this whole time. You might not do things exactly the same. Your Northwest region might not do things the same as your Southwest region. You know, one EMS agency might want to do things slightly different from another EMS agency. One festival might want to use a similar form but not exactly the same as another one. So there's a lot of things that you can do within here. So when you're modifying the design of forms, you can change the form element name. And that's that display that you see right here. So what do people see on the form? You can change the form element options. So for example, there are different options for date of birth, for things like your vitals. You've got your different stroke STEMI options, things like that. Even your patient ID has got different options to it, and we'll review those momentarily. You can make form elements required. For those of you that aren't familiar, anything with an asterisk on a form is required. And that's something that you can actually customize on a form-by-form basis. What fields are required to be completed before someone's allowed to submit that form? You can move form elements around. Maybe you say, hey, I don't like where that field is at. We can move it around into other locations. And then you can also, of course, add or delete form elements. You look at a form and you go, oh, I don't really need that field. I need this one instead. You can create new groupings, and groupings are what have this gray header at the top. So it's a way of grouping the bits of information together. So in this one, you can see we've got a couple of fields here, and then we've got patient information with a few more fields. So you have that option in there. You also can add instructions. Now, for those of you, just so that you know, those of you that are familiar with EM resource forms, these are going to be very similar if you haven't been in EMTrack forms. They're very similar. There are some differences in that we have specific data elements, so specific form elements that you can actually utilize. So you can't create anything you want. We do have a restriction within there that you can only use the fields that we've given you. But as always with everything, if you come across the need for a field that we don't have in there, you can always reach out to us. For those of you who have never heard me give my spiel before or who have never been through this, most of the changes that we make to our applications are based on feedback from the folks that are using it. So if you guys see somewhere where we can improve, where you say, hey, it would be really great if the application could do this. Hey, I'd really like to see it do that. Hey, this doesn't really work for me. Could we tweak it this way? I think this would be better. Reach out to us. Let us know. You guys are the ones that are in these applications every day, in and out. And while we're in and out of them every day, we're not using them the same way that you are. So just so that you know, you can always reach out to us if you have thoughts. If you go, I wish it did this, or I wish you'd change this, I'd like to see this. Hey, I've got some suggestions for you. Pass those along to us, please. We welcome them with open arms. Now, there's one other thing that I didn't add in here that we'll talk about when I get into we'll demonstrate when I get into the forms, and that's the actual elements, the data elements that exist in the system. So as you guys know, we talked about this a little bit during the last session, but there are changes that you can make to the data elements that will apply across the state that will actually affect what information is displayed here. And let's go ahead and flip back over to my browser here. So first thing I want to show you is I'm going to come down here into one of my vaccination forms. I'm going to come into that vaccination administration form. You'll notice when I click on the down arrow here, I have a number of options. So I can view the published. So I can say, what does it really look like? What do I have published out there now? I can edit, which takes me into where I can set the icons. I can go ahead and set something for daily tracking, which for those of you that are looking for vaccination, that daily tracking option might be something that you might be interested in if you're going to have someone follow a patient through. They can use that same tablet, follow the patient through, and they won't have to re-enter or rescan their barcode every time. Again, it is a single device thing where you start that run and you keep that patient and you keep them on that same device all the way through the process, through all the forms, and then you end it when they're done. Again, it was created, in case you couldn't tell by the verbiage, start run, for those EMS folks that are starting a run. They might have to submit a bunch of different information or a couple of forms on the exact same patient, and they end the run when they get to the hospital and they deliver the patient. So that was where that design and verbiage came from, but it can be used for other opportunities as well. You have the opportunity to copy a form. So remember when I said, hey, you might have a form that's, that maybe you've got set at the state level, or maybe you like what we have for a Juvare form, but you want to change it slightly. You can copy it. It then becomes a form, and it'll be labeled with your location, and then you'll be able to go ahead and make changes to it. You've got that download option, which we talked about, and I will demonstrate for you, where you can actually download a form and send it to somebody else, or they can download a form and send it to you, and then you can import it. You can delete forms. So if you actually have a form that you created and then you decided that you just absolutely can't stand it, it doesn't work, and you want to start from scratch, or somebody else sent you one that you like a lot better, you can delete forms so that your list of forms is not massively large. Now, the last portion here is the design. So I'm going to go ahead and click that design button here. And this is what actually takes you into that form design. What does it look like? For those of you that are familiar with the EM resource side of things, this is the equivalent of clicking questionnaire. So this is going to give you that information on all the fields that are going to be in here, how they're grouped together. And then here's where you can configure. What do you want to make required? What do you want to make not required? So here in the vaccination administration one, you can see we've got the incident involvement, which is going to require folks to select the incident that they're a part of, their current location. We also give them that option to select the sublocation if there's a sublocation. We've got that patient's ID, and I'm going to go ahead and click edit on that because I want to show you. Let's say I don't want to call that the ID. Maybe I want to call that the client ID. Maybe we call them clients rather than calling them patients, or we want to make it longer or shorter. We can put that information in here. You have the option to enter a tooltip. So you can say, hey, what information do I want to provide here? And I'm going to say, please enter the client ID. So if someone hovers over it, they'll actually see that prompt that says, please enter the client ID. Now, in the case of an ID, we also have this generate option. So for those of you who maybe haven't looked in the system recently, you have an option to either generate the patient ID so that people don't actually have to have an ID. This comes in really handy for the folks that are using it for daily tracking, where they're tracking every patient that they transport from EMS into the hospital, things like that, because it will automatically generate an ID. You don't have to use tags with codes. You don't have to use some type of magic combination that people have to remember of, their agency number and the date and the time, or any combination like that. We will actually auto-generate it. Now, on top of that, if this was actually a form that was a daily tracking form, I would have a third option in here that would say only for daily tracking, which would mean if somebody clicked Start Run, it would automatically generate that tracking number. If they didn't click Start Run, it would not generate it. So just keep that in mind, that you do have options like that that you'll see for that tracking number. And again, like I said, from the aspect of folks who are doing daily patient tracking, tracking folks from an EMS response, either to discharge and if they are being transported, or if they're not being transported, you can take them all the way through to the hospital or identify them as discharged, and you don't have to come up with that new number or a numbering scheme, anything like that, because we will actually generate an ID for you. So I wanted to point that out because I know that's one of the things that sometimes can get a little confusing for folks. Next, we've got your name. Obviously, you can go in here and you can enter and select if you wanted to change the name. So maybe I'm going to make the first name required, and I'm going to change this from middle name to middle initial, and I am going to require a last name, but I'm not requiring that middle initial. You'll notice when I save my changes, now I have that first name showing here. Middle initial is not required, but it is showing middle initial rather than name, and it's showing last name. We have a similar option here for the date of birth. So sometimes we like to know the age, sometimes we like to know the date of birth, right? So we can go ahead and say, I want you to show the age. Do you want to make it required? Maybe we want the date of birth required. We also have an approximate option, and I'm going to leave that on here so that you guys can see what that does. So basically, that is a field that lets you go ahead and either provide the date of birth, which is a required field, and then on top of that, someone can indicate like, hey, I think they're X number of years old. A lot of times this comes in handy for your EMS personnel if they have someone who they aren't able to identify how old they are. They can say, well, I think they're approximately X years old. This is the appearance, things like that. This can come in handy for situations like mass shootings where you have a significant number of patients and they might not have any ID with them. Hey, I think they're about this old. That way you at least get an idea of an age range on that person. So I'm going to take this one and I'm actually going to turn off that approximate, and I'm going to go ahead and show the age just because I like people to be able to translate that date of birth into the age and know exactly how old someone is. Similarly, we have options over here under the vital signs, and I do want to show you guys this just so that you know that these options exist. So you can see this. We can go ahead and add in those vital signs. You can make things required or not required. You can choose if you want their temperature to be shown in Celsius or Fahrenheit. We can go ahead and select that we want that conversion. We can do their SpO2. Now you'll notice on top of that I haven't selected the end tidal CO2, but you can select that for a form if you wanted to. We also have pain levels that you can select blood glucose. You can choose if you want that unit conversion. It can be entered in different ways. We have the ability to provide the Glasgow Coma scale, so if somebody needed to do that. AVPU, obviously we have a number of options that you can see in here. And you can see as I've added those into this form, you can see all those different bits of information that you have in here. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that these fields all exist, that you have all of these options. And again, you can come in here and you can preview this and you can say, oh, yep, that's what I wanted, or no, you know what, I don't want the Glasgow Coma score, things like that. And you can go ahead and validate. If you enter in the information, it'll tell you, yep, you've entered enough, or no, you haven't. You'll see on temperature, I have that option to change between Fahrenheit and Celsius. So we've added some options in here just by doing those configuration changes. So I wanted to make sure that you guys can see that that all exists. Now I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of here. And I'm going to come back in here into our vaccination registration form. Actually, we'll do the vaccination screening form. That's an even better one. So we're going to come in here into the vaccination screening form, and you can say, hey, you know what, as part of that screening, maybe I want to go ahead and have somebody do their temperature check and things like that. So I want them to take their vitals. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, you know what, in addition to asking those screening questions, I want someone to do a vitals evaluation. And I can come in here and I'm going to say, you know what, I want them to get a blood pressure, I want them to get a pulse, and I want them to get a temp and a respiratory rate. Those are the pieces of information I'm looking for. I just want to make sure they're You know, they're at a certain health level before we actually go ahead and consider giving them the vaccination. Now, I can come in here if I wanted to add a different grouping, or if I said, you know what, I want to add this into the patient information rather than the screening questions. I can grab the hamburger in the top left here, and I can move it, and you can see the pale blue bar behind it that identifies where I'm moving this to. We also have the option to move sections. So let's say for whatever reason I wanted to move screening questions above the patient information. We can do that exact same thing. We can move things around. We can rearrange them. I'm going to take this one and drop it back down. There we go. Oh, fine, we'll bring this one up. With longer forms, sometimes it can be fun trying to move them around here. So you can see we've got that location information, patient information, and those screening questions all back in the order that we wanted. So here we're going to see a few things. So we've got that option to delete, so maybe I don't want to know if they're symptomatic or not. And you'll notice if I click edit, the field that's being used for that is contaminated. So we've used that contaminated indicator to say, hey, are they symptomatic, are they not symptomatic? Which is where, again, having those vital signs evaluated before we start looking at that point will probably help us out. We can also identify, then we've got the screening questions. So here's some information that's the screening questions, and you might say, you know what, this is really more related to influenza. I really need my questions to be about COVID because I'm doing COVID vaccinations, right? Or maybe you want to change up the questions. Just so that you know, at this point, these questions are set at a client level. So if you're a state, they're at the state level, they apply across the state. So whatever questions are set in here are going to be available across the board. So if those need to be changed, you actually have to go into the system settings and into the data elements to change those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll walk in there so I can show you where that is. So in here, again, system settings, on the left-hand side here, we have data elements. So for those of you that haven't been in here, this is where those settings are for things like location on body, for your gender selections. Obviously, in the last few years, we've had a lot of changes in gender choices. If you need to add additional gender choices, you can add them in here. Hospital dispositions, languages spoken. We've got a lot of different options in here. So we're looking at those pre-screening and screening questions, and you'll notice those are fields right in here. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to pick that pre-screening question. And you can see, here's all my questions. I can pick one and I can edit it. I can add a question. So I'm going to add a question and say, has the client ever tested positive for COVID? And I'll click save. And I can move these around. So I put this down at the bottom. Maybe I want to put it all the way up at the top and say this is one of the very first ones. And I want to include a comments field. So we've got that in here, so I can go ahead and set that up. Now, what did that do? If we come back over here into that form, into that patient form, and we come in that vaccination screening form, and I go into the design, you'll see here that question is now showing up here. Have they ever tested positive for COVID? It's up at the top. So the changes that you make to the pre-screening and screening questions in the data elements under system settings are going to affect what shows up when you add those screening and pre-screening questions. Now, maybe we say in here, you know what, we're only getting this. We also want to grab a gender. All we have to do is grab that on the left-hand side and drag it to where we want it. And that will go ahead and add that additional field in there. Maybe we say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and save this one. We'll save and publish it, let everybody see what it looks like. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to come into the registration section. Maybe we want to talk about insurance, right? We're registering them, we're getting all this information. How are they going to pay for this? We have the option to add insurance where they can actually provide that information and we can enter it in here. Now, on a mobile form, we have two additional fields that can be included that I find really useful when you're dealing with things like insurance or identification. And agreement, you know, has someone agreed, yes, they've consented that they're going to have it. We have on the mobile devices, we have the ability to add a signature field and the ability to take photos. So what I find a lot of folks doing is that they may have this insurance field in here, but they'll also have a photo option where they'll say, okay, I want someone to, instead of even entering the insurance information, or maybe in addition, I want them to take a picture of the front and back of someone's card or the front and back of their driver's license as they go along. And that's another thing that I do want to point out for those of you who haven't used it, is you do have the opportunity to scan a driver's license if you add that driver's license field, so driver's license or a state ID, and it will populate the information that's on that 2D barcode on the form. So just keep that in mind, that you've got all of those different options going on. And that does work. The scan driver's license, if you're using a web device, the web form, you actually have to go ahead and have a 2D scanner, which I know most of our medical folks have. But I do want to point out to you that you do have to have a scanner that'll scan a 2D barcode. For the triage, the triage tag or the ID, the client ID, the patient ID, whatever you want to call it, that one you only need to be able to scan a 1D barcode. But the driver's license encodes a whole bunch of information in it. And I will tell you that the information does vary from state to state. So that is something that is set at the state level in terms of what is encoded into that 2D barcode. So if you scan someone from one state, you might get all the information you ever wanted and more. For the other, you might get minimal fields. You might get a first name, last name, a gender. For others, you'll get an height, weight, age, date of birth, the whole 9 yards, address, and everything. And that is something that's, again, set at the state level. So that information will vary from state to state. So it looks like we've, as I expected, I talked for a little longer than I expected, but hopefully this gives you guys some information. I do want to point out up here in the top right, you can insert a new group, which would allow you to maybe segment information differently. And you can also add in instructions. So this allows you to say, give guidance to the folks who are filling out the form. Please enter all fields that have a red asterisk. Click submit when finished. If you have questions, call support at 555-555-1234. So you can provide guidance within that form. And this exists for both the mobile and the web form. So I'm going to save that in here. You'll notice it goes to the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and take that all the way up to the top here. And then I'm going to save and publish that form. And now that form has instructions for folks when they're looking at it. So now that I've unfortunately taken up 50 minutes of our hour, I think that's pretty much about it for me. Does anyone have any questions that you guys would like answered?
I think we did have some questions. Catherine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I do have a couple questions. Thank you, first of all. This was very helpful. I appreciate you taking the time to demo this. I have a question about downloading the forms. It looks like when you download the forms, is it only to be able to share an import into EMTrack? I haven't found a nice, pretty way to download the form with all of the data elements that we've built out on the form.
Yes, sorry about that. I completely forgot to go back to that one. Yes, so when you download it, this is the type of file name that you get. It is specifically built for you to be able to download it and send it to someone else. So are you looking to do like basically just kind of wanting to let somebody see what it looks like type of thing?
Yeah, like in a PDF maybe.
Okay, usually for that, what I recommend, and just so that you know, this is what you guys will see when if you do that export, and if you do the download and get one from someone and import it, is it does give you the option to select if you want to publish it, if you want to make it visible, if you want to make it a daily tracking form. This is what you get when you actually do that upload of a form that someone sends to you. So usually what I recommend for folks when they're looking for kind of what you are, where you want to show somebody what it looks like, is that you go ahead and actually look at that form, and then you can right-click and select print, and it will go ahead and allow you to actually print that to a PDF file. So you can see, and you can see the fields. It doesn't necessarily line everything up perfectly with a page break, but then someone can actually see what the form looks like.
Okay, great. Thanks.
No problem.
I do have additional questions. So if anyone, if I'm hogging it, just, cut me off, please, for those that are on the phone. One of the challenges that I can see at the state of Wisconsin is the login feature via PIN versus fingerprint versus password. And the goal that we want for our EMS is that when they begin to track a patient on the scene of an accident in the field, and they start with their triage form, that when that patient gets moved over to the treatment area and a new EMS user is starting treatment on this patient, is to be able to pull up all of the information like you showed by that patient ID, and pull that information forward. We're curious if I guess the best way to do that, we want to start rolling this out. We haven't rolled this out yet in Wisconsin, but we want to start with, the MCIs and getting people up to speed with utilizing the system. And we're worried that if we do it the password way, users just will forget their passwords. And how are they going to log in during an MCI and be able to show that visibility of that patient information throughout tracking them in the system? So do you have any suggestions or insight about
passwords
that?
Passwords are definitely one of those, because for those of you who don't know, for EMTrack, you are required to reset your password every 90 days. So in case you didn't know that, if you have an account that has access to EMTrack, it is required, the password will be required to be reset every 90 days. And that's obviously because there's patient data in here. It's a security thing. So no, if you're thinking of the question, can we remove that? The answer is no. A lot of times that PIN is the easier way to go. So the PIN allows them to get in and do that data entry. And if they're using the mobile forms, the data entry is obviously for those EMS folks, that's kind of their primary aspect, is they're entering the patient information. Now, just so that you guys know, if you haven't had experience with the PIN versus the password, the PIN only gives them access to enter patients. They can't come in. So even if they log into the web with a PIN, they cannot search or anything like that. The mobile app obviously was designed strictly for entry of patients. So it wasn't designed with all the additional functionality that the web version has. So what you can do, so it's one of those things, and we can talk through this offline, but depending on the information you're looking for, obviously doing that load patient on the mobile app is going to be very useful for you, or on the web app if that's what you're using. But by the same token, doing that and going ahead and having that load option in there with someone using a PIN, they tend to remember PINs, right? If somebody sets their own PIN, let's be honest, we've got them for everything these days. So they're going to remember that PIN, and if their device lets them, they can use their fingerprint, which is another nice functionality.
Yeah, so if folks have the same device for an MCI, Catherine, as they typically use, once they set it up, then they can just use the fingerprint for everything.
Yep.
And you'll be able to search for patients and track that patient through each of the forms.
Right. So what they would do is
with the fingerprint.
Right. So what they would end up doing is you would have a form set up that would allow them to enter that ID. So for example, that 1234, right, where it says, oh, they already exist, and then I could go ahead and load them, or I can, in this case, because it's a web form, I can go to the edit. But I would have that option to go ahead and actually load the information for them. And that would then fill in, just like it did when I showed you guys. It would actually go ahead and fill in all of that information that's already been entered. Now, there are obviously some aspects of that that are not going to, so we would probably want to talk through what's the information that's being entered in that initial triage versus what they need to see. Are those fields that we do auto-populate? So we probably want to talk through that, and I know you've been working with Elaine, but I would say my recommendation is, especially because they're going to be using the forms, is going to be a PIN option. So they may have a password to get in on the web, but a password user can also have a PIN, just so that you guys are aware of that. It's not, a PIN user is a PIN-only user, but a password user can also have a PIN. So for example, when I log in on the web, I log in with a password, but when I log in on my mobile device, I use a PIN.
Okay.
Does that, I know, unfortunately, without knowing what fields you're looking at wanting and like what workflow you're wanting, it's hard for me to say definitively, like, yes, load and you will be good. But
No,
I want to make sure that you.
I get it. Yeah.
So,
and
yeah,
honestly,
we would be able to go through it and do it. Okay.
Okay. I'm sure I'll learn a little bit more once I get into that testing phase, and we'll have more conversation around it.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
I did have one more question, and I think it's really for the other partners on the phone. If you guys have set up EMTrack, I'm curious about the interface into wards, and if you have set that API up and have come into any challenges for EMS services that report into a third-party billing system versus directly into wards. And if you just have any suggestions or feedback for me, I would greatly appreciate it.
So for Coral maybe, but wards I think is a Wisconsin specific system, right? For billing?
From my understanding, that's a national, maybe I'm not.
Yeah, I think it might be a
sure. I thought it
rebranded
was a
version of
national
something
service.
else. Okay.
Okay. It's a NIMSIS application that is required to document all of your runs at a national level.
Yep.
But I'm not an EMS person, so I could be really butchering this explanation.
Coral, if you want to jump in and if you have some perspective on this, that'd be great. If not, we can put you in touch with a couple other folks.
Sure.
We'll ask around and who might be a good person for you to chat with about this. Great. Any other questions?
No, I think I'm good. Thanks.
Great. Thanks for joining and thank you for asking the questions. It's exactly why we do this. So really appreciate the participation. And if you have suggestions or topics on what you would like us to cover next time, please let us know. Margot, thank you for leading this session. And I'll send out a recording so that you can share it with your colleagues.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.